Number of guests duly introduced by fellows beg leave to attend your meeting. Is it your pleasure that I welcome them in your name? Thank you. Minutes.
Christmas soiree, Thursday, the 12th of December, 2024, Burlington House and online. Professor Martin Millett, President in the chair. The minutes of the ordinary meeting of Thursday, the 5th of December, 2024 were read and signed. The following, being in attendance and having signed the obligation required by the statutes, were duly admitted fellows. John C. Benjamin. The following communication was then laid before the Society. Returning to Our Roots, the Council for British Archaeology at 80, by Neil Redfern, FSA, and Gail Boyle, FSA. Thanks were returned for this communication. The President announced that the next meeting would be on Thursday, the 6th of February, 2025, and then adjourned the meeting. A Christmas reception followed.
Is it your pleasure that I sign these minutes as a true and complete record? Thank you. Ballots.
The following candidates for election will be put to ballot, which closes on the 6th of March. I am reading the short version of the blue paper. The full version is available now for inspection on the Fellows platform. Edward Archer, former chairman and committee member of Lanark and District Archaeological Society. Mike Bintley, Associate Professor in Medieval English Literature at the University of Southampton. Katie Carter, Editor, English Heritage. Rebecca Foote, Director of Archaeology and Cultural Heritage Research for the Royal Commission of Alula, Saudi Arabia. Noah Herringman, Curator's Distinguished Professor of English, University of Missouri, specializing in 18th and 19th century British literature. Matthew Simon Hobson, Archaeologist and Associate Director, Wardle Armstrong. Shushma Jansari, Curator of South Asia at the British Museum and a Trustee of the Roald Dahl Museum and Story Centre. John Christopher Jenkins, Co-Director of the Centre of Pilgrimage Studies, University of York. Ollie Jones, Senior Lecturer in Theatre, University of York, specialising in architecture and archaeology of early medieval, modern performance. Gladys Montiel, Specialist in Roman Samian pottery. Jane Elizabeth Rempel, Assistant Professor in Greek Archaeology, University of Cambridge. Laura Slack, Head of Major Projects, Historic England. Daniel Starzer Smith, Senior Lecturer in English Literature, King's College London, and Co-Director of the Letter Locking Project. And Malcolm Thick, Independent Scholar with interests in agricultural and food history.
Thank you. We now come to the main business of this evening's meeting to hear a paper from our fellow Professor Andrew Fleming. Andrew is a prehistorian, landscape archaeologist who has taught at the Universities of Sheffield and University of Wales, Lampeter. Many of you will know Andrew is one of our leading authorities on prehistoric landscapes. He's published numerous papers in academic journals and a series of books on memorably the landscape in Swaledale and landscape in St Kilda, from which he's speaking to us this evening. He now lives in Herefordshire with interests in the longue durée topics such as transhumance, woodland pasture, ancient routeways, and long-term perceptions of regional landscapes. It's a great pleasure to welcome Andrew this evening to present a paper, St Kilda, a Rosetta Stone for early sheep races in the Northeast Atlantic region. Welcome, Andrew.
Well, Good evening, everybody, and thank you all for coming. My wife reckons there wouldn't be an audience for sheep. I'm afraid I'm reading my paper. I don't trust myself to do otherwise. At least that way we should keep to time, and I should keep to a reasonable degree of clarity. In recent years, I've been rather busy doing research for my book on the history of St Kilda, published last October. Quite a lot of this book is based on a comparatively new resource for scholars, that is, digitized newspapers. The Gravity of Feathers is essentially about people. I didn't expect, when I was researching it, to be plunged into the world of sheep. Now, as many of you will know, St Kilda is an archipelago which lies some 40 miles west of the Western Isles of Scotland. The main and mainly only seriously habitable island, Hirta, was inhabited by a resilient and remarkable community, which eventually dwindled to the point where it had to be evacuated in 1930. And this is the iconic picture of the St Kildans taken in 1886 during a general election, and thereby hangs a tale. Many of you will also know something of Soays sheep. They've lived on the Isle of Soays since time out of mind, and they're recognized by archaeologists as descendants of a primitive and probably Bronze Age race of sheep, which are relatively close to their wild mouflon ancestor. Here they are, luxuriating in the Cotswolds Rare Breeds Centre, and here they are in their more traditional habitat in and around, well, beside the Isle of Soays, just in the St Kilda archipelago. Soays are often to be seen at rare breed centres and occasionally grazing beside reconstructed Iron Age roundhouses. Their agility is legendary. One of my neighbours in Herefordshire recently sent all her Soays flock to the abattoir in despair because of the difficulty of coping with them. General Pitt Rivers, as you'll know, was the first archaeologist to recognise the significance of the Soays for prehistorians. In the 1860s, he lived in Upper Phillimore Gardens in South Kensington, not that far from here, and just across the street from the only man who owned Soays, the MacLeod of MacLeod of Dunvegan Castle on the Isle of Skye, and the Laird of St Kilda from 1871. In the early 1880s, Pitt Rivers obtained some Soays for his park at Rushmore on Cranbourne Chase. Having been carried down the steep slopes of Soays in net bags or roped to the backs of the men, they survived an epic journey of several legs by sea and rail until they eventually arrived at Tisbury Station, which is the local one for Cranbourne Chase. Henceforth, archaeologists were to use the bones of Soays as essential components of their reference collection. For British archaeologists thinking about reconstructions of prehistoric life, Soays are the go-to sheep par excellence. For over 60 years, they've also been the subject of what is probably the longest-running zoological project in the world, the Soays Sheep Project, whose participants have produced hundreds of research papers. Now, if the Soays have rather hogged the limelight, at least among archaeologists, St Kilda's other sheep, the Borerays, have stayed largely in the shadows. Their eponymous ancestral home is another steep-sided island in the archipelago, which lies 4 miles from St Kilda. In 1957, the naturalist John Morton Boyd took a look at the Borerays and said this: although they resemble a cross between the Soay and modern Scottish blackface, they represent a cross between an early type of Scottish blackface with a Hebridean type of old Scottish short wool. This was also the view of Michael Ryder, who compared them to the traditional sheep of Orkney and Shetland. And that quote there represents the complexity of view of people who try to size up strange sheep from their appearance. It's a tricky subject. Judging from the sheep's appearance then, their phenotype, the experts rejected any apparent similarity between Borerays and Soays, preferring to think of the Borerays as a race of relatively recent origin, developed during the late 19th century, according to the website of the Department of Animal Science at Oklahoma State University. This view of the status of Boreray sheep may have influenced the approach of the Nature Conservancy in 1957, which actually considered wiping out the Borerays on Borerays in order, they said, to give useful control on the development of vegetation when freed of all grazing pressures. Fortunately, they didn't do this. So in recent years, the origins of Borerays sheep have been thought to be, well, kind of medieval going on modern. Although not many Borerays are kept on the British mainland, in rare breed centres, they are steadily becoming more appreciated, their status having moved from critical to vulnerable recently. Jane Cooper keeps a flock in Orkney. She has sung their praises recently in her book, The Lost Flock, which is a good read, by the way. So if the Soays have hogged the limelight and the Borerays have lurked in the wing, my third race of St Kilda sheep has entered the stage in disguise. These smart-looking little black animals are Hebrideans. There are now well over 20,000 of them on the globe, and they're in great demand for what is known as conservation grazing. Many of the people who keep Hebrideans don't realize that for much of the 20th century, these sheep were mostly called St Kildas. As my research has revealed, that was for the very good reason that their ancestors did come from St Kilda. Human memory is short and can be very misleading. In this book, published by the Hebridean Sheep Society as recently as 2009, one of the contributors has written this: "We, the livestock inspectors, considered one of the breed's names, St Kilda, to be a somewhat fanciful invention by southern owners that was intended to add an aura of mystery and romance to their sheep, and the inspectors preferred the more accurate name, Hebridean. However, the inspectors were wrong. They were the fanciful ones. The ancestors of the so-called Hebridean sheep did come from St Kilda, in fact. They were first exported from the archipelago sometime around 1830, and they became the prestigious ornaments of the parks of wealthy and often aristocratic owners right up to the time of the First World War. The first man to fetch St Kildas from the archipelago was either the Marquis of Breadalbane at Tayforth Castle in Perthshire, or possibly Sir Thomas Kennedy, who lived at Dalquarran Castle in Ayrshire. One of them nowadays in rather better repair than the other. Such men liked to visit St Kilda on their yachts. Many of these trips were under-recorded or not recorded at all, as you might imagine. However, we do have one newspaper account of a trip taken by two brothers, Frederick and Mark Milbank, who held large estates in North Yorkshire at Barningham and Thorpe Perrow. Their visit took place in the mid-1850s. Mark Milbank purchased 28 ewes and 2 rams from the islanders. They were transported to Loch Seaforth on Harris, where the Milbanks were staying as guests of Lord Dunmore. From there, the sheep travelled by steamship to Glasgow and then by rail to North Yorkshire, with their legs tied together. They did well at Thorpe Perrow, which you see here. It's now an arboretum, which you can visit, by the way. Mark Milbank enjoyed their presence on his dinner table, and he also said that their wool made capital stocking. Milbank showed a tup and 2 ewes at the first Bedale Agricultural Show. They were highly commended. When the Milbanks first came across them, The St Kilda sheep were apparently a sort of dun, bluish grey and dark brown, and they all bore a patch on the rump, like the red deer. Around the same time, that is in the mid-1850s, some other St Kilda sheep were acquired by Sir John Ord, who occupied a great house at Kilmorey, near the south end of the Crinan Canal in Argyllshire. Ord's farm manager, James Aitchison, who was a highly respected animal breeder, may have been one of the first to breed the animals towards black, which apparently wouldn't have been very hard to do. You can see a postcard image of the Kilmorey sheep on this slide. Sir John's St Kildas appeared in an agricultural show at Glasgow in 1867. They were described as small and wholly black. What impressed the spectators were some of the rams, which sported 4 black horns, 2 shorter ones involuted downwards, almost enclosing the face, and 2 very long ones, arching upward and outward, admirable pointed weapons, which from the fire of its black eyes, the creature is evidently ready enough to use. There he is. Although the fineness of their wool was greatly admired, St Kildas were not really a commercial proposition. They were ornamental, parkland livestock, and normally regarded as such. This is a map of the most prominent people who kept them, leaving out their titles, otherwise the map would be totally cluttered. Queen Victoria, who's not on this map, kept a few at Windsor Great Park. After her death, they went to London Zoo. One of Edward VII's favourite mistresses, Daisy, Countess of Warwick, kept St Kildas at Easton Lodge in Essex for well over 30 years. And the owners of St Kildas included men from the uppermost echelons of the aristocracy, people like the Duke of Hamilton or the Earl of Harwood. There were also entrepreneurial families like the Asherton Smiths at Faenol in North Wales, and they owned the huge slate quarries at Port in Orwick nearby. St Kilda owners also included top politicians, such as Lord Ullswater, who'd been Speaker of the House of the Commons for 16 years when he was known as James Lowther. Such men had often been educated at Eton or Harrow, and either Christ Church, Oxford, or Trinity College, Cambridge. They also tended to be members of the Carlton Club. You're doubtless getting the picture. From a historical point of view, the most interesting St Kildas were the ones kept at Lake Windermere in the Lake District. Some of these were owned by J.D. Bridson, who came from a family of industrialists. Bridson had a house on Belle Isle, an island on Lake Windermere itself, where in 1877 he was daft enough to hold sheepdog trials using some St Kilda sheep. It was reported that some of the sheep selected were black, Scotch, horned ones, and in place of being driven by the dogs, they speedily turned on the latter and drove them, using their horns to some effect in butting the dogs. Having rid themselves of the dogs, several of them took a swim in the lake and had to be rescued by boats. Bridson also kept his St Kildas on the high ground to the west of Lake Windermere, not very far from Hilltop, where Beatrix Potter was to keep her Herdwicks 30 or 40 years later. And just across the water from Belle Isle was Storrs Hall, now a hotel, and the home of the Reverend Thomas Staniforth, who also kept St Kildas on his home farm. A very nice photograph of them survived, as you can see on the right of this slide, with his farm manager, who may well be wearing a suit made of St Kilda tweed. We know he had one. Staniforth died in 1887. This St Kilda sheep was sold at an auction on the farm. Pitt Rivers came. He got someone else to read his paper in order that he could attend the auction. And he bought some. Well, one thing we do know is that the ancestors of the Windermere St Kildans came direct from St Kilda to the Lake District, and they were probably transported on a yacht owned by one of the Bridson family. They probably arrived around about 1870. This is valuable information because, as it happens, the Windermere St Kildas were ancestral to the 4 St Kilda flocks which survive in England to this day. You may see them for yourselves if you go to Western Under Lizard in Staffordshire, Tatton Park in Cheshire, Harwood Park in North Yorkshire, and Kirk Hamerton, which is not far from Harwood, on land bought by Staniforth not long before his death. These are the 4 flocks in question. The families who kept the St Kildas of the Windermere group sometimes exchanged rams. I suspect that this group of flocks might be of particular interest to geneticists because of their relatively well-known history and interconnection. But how did these sheep come to be known as Hebrideans rather than St Kildas? The change of name from St Kilda to Hebridean was quite deliberate. Indeed, it was promoted by the experts. In 1912, the naturalist Richard Lydekker published a book called The Sheep and Its Cousins. It included these words: the small black St Kilda sheep kept in several, the small black so-called St Kilda sheep kept in several English parks appear to be of uncertain and mixed origin in most cases, being more or less crossed with Black Welsh or other primitive breeds. Lydekker had actually taken his cue from the naturalist John Guillemille, who was the son of the famous painter. And he published his book on the mammals of Britain and Ireland back in 1906. Now, this book contained a photograph of St Kilda sheep in North Yorkshire. The caption asserted that they had been named in error, being actually a deteriorated variety of Hebridean sheep. And a few years later, another expert, Henry Elwes, stated that the St Kilda was a mongrel in which the Scotch blackface has a considerable share. Now, it might interest you to know that Millais' home on the edge of Horsham in West Sussex was only 10 minutes' walk from that of Norman Magnus MacLeod, the owner of the St Kilda archipelago in 1906. Some 20 or 30 years previously, it was Norman Magnus's father who'd established the historic importance of Soays in conversation with General Pitt Rivers and the naturalist Henry Nottage Moseley. Many of you will probably realize that Pitt Rivers is the one in the middle, and you might be able to pick out the clan chief as well. The MacLeods were evidently very proud of being the owners and suppliers of Soay sheep, and they liked to insist that the Soays were the only authentically ancient race of sheep in the St Kilda archipelago. And in 1925, Norman Magnus was quoted in the Hampshire Advertiser as saying that the St Kildas were probably descendants of the old Hebridean sheep. He also said, why these sheep should have been called St Kildas is unknown, because they never existed on that island. Confusingly, the MacLeods also preferred to refer to Soays as St Kildas. Norman Magnus MacLeod, a former big game hunter and colonial administrator in South Africa, probably booked no disagreement, as you can perhaps guess from that photograph in the middle of the slide. And in fact, one of his descendants had to go to South Africa to apologize for his behavior during the Zulu Wars. Anyway, leaving that aside, the views of Norman Magnus's brother Reginald, a distinguished retired civil servant who lived not very far away at Maidstone in Kent, must also have been hard to ignore. The story propagated by the MacLeods, in my view, contained an implicit social message. The story that they themselves, the MacLeods, were essentially old family, and they've been layers of St Kilda since at least the 13th century. It was they who owned the Soays, for them, the only authentically old race of sheep in the archipelago. The St Kilda sheep, on the other hand, were mongrels with diverse origins, somewhere in the Hebridean. They were analogous to the MacLeod's own tenants on St Kilda. Back in the 1720s, there had been a lethal outbreak of chickenpox, and the population had to be augmented by new colonists from various parts of the MacLeod domain, who had been sentenced to transportation in the open-air courts held by the then chief. In this account, there's a neat symmetry. The status and prestige of the sheep matched that of their owner. A colonial administrator like Norman Magnan would have been quite accustomed to making judgments about the relative merits and racial origins of the indigenous peoples of South Africa. My research shows that the tale told by the MacLeods and the Edwardian naturalists was quite wrong. And actually, the name change didn't fully catch on. After the First World War, many great landowners evidently got rid of their St Kildas. Their financial difficulties are quite well known, I think. These were sometimes bought up by owners who were usually of less exalted social status. And for much of the 20th century, these people continued to call the St Kildas by their old name. As I've said, it was only in the 1970s, when the sheep started to regain their popularity, that they started being called Hebrideans again. However, if you turn up at Western Under Lizard or Tatton Park and say you want to see the St Kildas, they know exactly which sheep you're talking about. Anyway, all this means that, remarkably, there have been not 2, but 3 races of pre-modern sheep in the St Kilda archipelago. This leads me to wonder whether this might provide a kind of Rosetta stone, which might illuminate some aspects of the history of sheep breeding, sheep management in this region. So in what sequence were they brought out here to this remote archipelago? Let us assume that imported sheep were always intended for Hirta, the only seriously habitable island, and that when a new race of sheep was introduced, sheep already there were confined to an outlying island. The sequence then becomes fairly obvious. If Soays were truly prehistoric sheep, as everyone agrees, and the St Kildas were the ones kept on Hirta in the early 19th century, the ancestors of the Borerays are likely to have come somewhere between them. The sequence would then be Soays, introduced in the Bronze Age or conceivably earlier, then Borerays, perhaps in the Iron Age, broadly speaking, and then the St Kildas, which were probably the sheep of the Viking Age. Soay means the Isle of Sheep, a Norse name which must have been coined on the arrival of the first Vikings. It presumably implies that Soay sheep were already on the island then. The presence of these 3 races of primeval sheep in the archipelago tends to confirm my view that St Kilda never took a holiday from history. Despite its remoteness, the archipelago was usually incorporated into contemporary socio-political networks, and the retention of sheep on outlying islands when they became old-fashioned may imply that the islanders placed enough value on their characteristics to be reluctant to get rid of them entirely. Now, pre-modern races of sheep in the northeast Atlantic region are classified as Scottish or northern short-tailed. Their tails contain varying numbers of vertebrae, but fewer than those of the long-tailed sheep. And there are something like 40 races of northern short-tails in existence today. I'm not going to take you through those, you'll be relieved to learn, but you can see some familiar and less familiar faces among them. To elucidate the history of each one and relationships between them is clearly a highly complex matter. It goes without saying that we need much more genetic research. It would be interesting to know which races of short-tails, if any, have preserved the characteristics of the sheep of the Iron Age, and in what circumstances these short-tailed races became differentiated from each other. If they were relatively isolated in various habitats, mostly on islands, with little or no selective breeding, what we see would be the result of genetic drift and genetic bottleneck. Isolation may be one dimension of this equation. On the other hand, this is a region of coastal and island communities linked by the highways of the sea. You won't need reminding of the distribution of megalithic tombs in the Neolithic. You won't need reminding of the distribution of megalithic tombs in the Neolithic, that of Brocks and related structures in the Iron Age, or of the dominance of the Vikings and of Norse settlers in the Middle Ages. The characteristics and history of the northern short-tails must also have been affected by the fact that, by definition, many of their ancestors must have been moved by sea. Here's a slide which was kindly shown to me by Hans Lenstra, which shows the kind of relationships which are emerging from early genetic research. You can see here, for instance, that the Soays and Borerays are quite close to each other on this particular metric and quite close to the North Rondelsays, whereas the Hebridean or St Kildans are rather closer to the Manx Locktons and the Jacobs, and indeed the Herdwick. And that might help us to think about their relationship, or perhaps happy to agree with me about what I've been saying so far. Genetics are not, however, my area of expertise. In the time left to me, I want to say a little bit more about the Borerays and the St Kildas. Most of the short-tails have two coats of wool, the inner one being a good deal finer than the outer, and their wool is usually plucked, rude, as they usually say, rather than sheared. Jane Cooper has waxed lyrical about the quality of the wool of her Borerays, which she keeps on Orkney. She says, I quote, "A lot of the wool is just fabulous, very fine and soft, and very interesting with the different colors. It is easy to hold a lock of fleece and pull apart the long, strong fibers of the outer coat from the undercoat. This one breed of sheep could supply everything that you would need, from the finest wool underwear to the most robust wool jacket, and tough netting and string made from the thicker hairs." In the age of the Vikings, these two coats of wool would have been very important for the making of waterproof sails. I had to have one of those, didn't I? Yarn derived from the outer coat was used for the warp, and the inner coat provides yarn for the weft. This created a twill pattern sailcloth. The fact that the wool isn't obtained by shearing is important. Jane Cooper says that if the fibers haven't been cut by shearing, they'll be sealed at both ends by the natural annual thinning of the wool fiber so that it can be shed. The intact fibers are far less likely to absorb water than sheared or cut fibers. Perhaps counterintuitively, experimental studies by weavers and shipwrights working together have demonstrated the efficacy of sails made from wool, which on Viking ships were fabricated by sewing together strips of woven material. Calculations derived from experimental archaeology have also persuaded scholars that making the sails for a fleet of Viking longships would have involved an immense investment of labor and considerable numbers of sheep, far more than we might at first imagine. And it's also likely that these ships helped to perpetuate themselves by being instrumental in securing the resource which did much of the work which was required to make them, namely slaves. And far from incidentally, sheep also provided the essential warm woolen clothing which protected mariners against exposure, one of their deadliest enemies. The original St Kilda sheep, and presumably the Borerays too, were variegated in colour an 18th century painting, and a couple of modern Hebridean, aka St Kilda flocks, visible on this slide. But I've also put in a couple of quotations from the 17th and 18th century writers on St Kilda. Generally, said Martin, they are speckled, some white, some philomort, which is a kind of orange-brown color, apparently. And then Macaulay said, the clothing of these people is quite coarse and made for warmth. All the colors known among them, till of late, were black, white, grey, and brown, the natural colors of their sheep, and yellow was their only artificial one. Weavers liked the choice provided by these natural colors. They didn't necessarily have to use dye. In those days, the St Kildas then were not the smart little black Hebrideans which we see today. They were a good deal more variegated. And this has become something of an issue among those who keep Hebrideans. Many of them like to breed their sheep to conform with the breed standard. However, there are also those who welcome the emergence of other colors as being much more representative of the original race. They speak rather disdainfully of what they call the showring culture and the exacting specifications of the Hebridean Sheep Society. And these are two modern flocks of St Kilda, aka Hebridean sheep, showing you the difference. Strathconan up in northeast Scotland, the sheep are pretty black. You can tell when they're getting on a bit by the grey colours, a bit like humans in that sense. And then west of Gladstone, which is in southern Scotland, the owner is particularly interested in the variegated quality of his flock and particularly expressive on the over-demanding showring culture which he faces. It's to be hoped that the Hebridean Sheep Society will never discourage those who like to breed the more variegated strain of St Kildas. For historians and archaeologists, I think this is rather an important issue. It's interesting that the sheep sequence in the St Kilda archipelago corresponds to a direction of travel which corresponds with increasing fleet weights, at any rate, among the present descendants of these races. These obviously are modern figures, but you can see there are quite significant differences as you go through the sequence I've been suggesting to you. We can see quite dramatic increases between Soays and Borerays, and between Borerays and St Kildas. Over the sequence as a whole, the average fleet weight more or less doubles. And in a listing of modern fleet weights of 11 northern short-tail races, St Kildas comes second only to Icelandic sheep, and their wool was exported and traded internationally and commercially in considerable numbers in the Middle Ages. And you shouldn't take these too literally, I guess, because they weren't compiled for this reason. But nevertheless, you can see that the Hebrideans and St Kildans are relatively close to the top of the league table here, with Soays and Borerays much closer to the bottom. I didn't put the other 30 breeds of the short tails on, you'll be relieved to know. These are modern sheep, of course, but their long histories and conditions of the Northeast Atlantic seem to make them mostly quite comparable. Somewhere, sometime, people must have bred these sheep selectively, seeking to improve the quantity of their wool as well as its quality. Traditional northern short tails, such as the St Kildas, were much better adapted to the conditions of the region than the modern sheep introduced at the time of the clearances in the late 18th century. Short tails were the ideal sheep for the household, and you didn't need to keep very many of them to clothe your family. They were generally free of scab and braxy, and they lambed easily. Their meat was delicious, and it still is, trust me. The ewes, which were very tame, let down a lot of milk relative to their body weight. The late David Kinsman, who kept St Kildas himself in the Lake District, suggested that this was because of centuries of being milked while they were still feeding their lamb. This may have been of critical importance on islands like St Kilda, where the question has sometimes been asked, how did the islanders manage to avoid getting scurvy? It's known that the St Kildas used to eat the leaves of sorrel, a plant which seems to have been quite plentiful on Hirta. Scurvy grass also forms part of the island's flora. However, I wonder if this was enough, especially when the population was at its height. And I can't help noticing that sheep milk contains 4 times as much vitamin C as cow's milk. The St Kildas are known to have made cheese from a mixture of cow's and sheep's milk. And joy of joys for cheese lovers like me, this cheese would certainly have been unpasteurized. There's also the question of multiple horns, or polyceratism. Some of the St Kilda rams, as I've shown already, sport 2 pairs of horns, occasionally more. This makes them look seriously intimidating. In terms of the history of domesticated sheep, this property apparently goes a long way back, all the way to Neolithic Çatalhöyük, in fact. The Luttrell Psalter in the early 14th century has a very good illustration of just such a ram. I'm afraid he's a bit longer than he should be because of errors in my clipping this image, but he's all there, isn't he, with his 4 horns. Sir Geoffrey Luttrell fought in the border wars in Scotland, and there's a theory that the 4-horned ram portrayed in his Psalter may have been a Scottish one. The incidence of polyceratism varies a good deal over time and space. Nobody seems to understand quite why. Did people select for it or against it? And in what circumstances? Apparently, the late Magnus Magnusson used to say that the Vikings loved to bet on ram fights. But I'm not sure he ever put this in writing. I haven't found the source at any rate. The Vikings, of course, loved competitive sports of all sorts. But although there are references in the literature to stallion fights, I haven't found any mentions of ram fighting yet. On a world basis, organized ram fights are not uncommon today. Apparently, Algeria is one of the hotspots, according to a long piece in The Guardian. It's considered pretty disreputable. That's ram fighting, not The Guardian. Much closer to home, there are a couple of intriguing references in the Stornoway Gazette to organized ram fighting, taking place at Ballot, which is near Stornoway, in 1946. No details are given. I should think that ram fighting was officially considered disreputable, even in Stornoway. In recent years, the application of archaeological science in the Northeast Atlantic region has shown us just what good managers of livestock the Vikings and their descendants were, considerably better, in fact, than their Iron Age predecessors. 2 teams of researchers have been involved. One worked with Ingrid Mainland in Orkney, comparing stock management at Mine Howe, an Iron Age site, with practices at Earl's Bew. And the other team worked with Neil Sharples at the site of Bornish, which is on South Uist in the Western Isles, pretty much within sight of St Kilda if you go up the nearest hill. In Orkney, the overall impression for the Viking site of Earl's Bew was this: an organized system of pastoral farming with specialist herds of sheep and cattle, pastured and fattened up on established home fields and/or specific upland zones tied to the estate. End of quote. By contrast, the Iron Age site involved, and I quote again, a less organized form of husbandry, primarily subsistence-based, perhaps with smaller numbers of animals per household, and in which stress events such as weaning were more randomly spread over the life of the animal, responding to herding decisions based on immediate need rather than specialized production goals. And Neil Sharple's team came to very much the same conclusions for Bornish in the Western Isles. A good grazing regime was important from the viewpoint of wool quality. In 1811, John MacDonald published his general view of the agriculture of the Western Isles, in which he discussed what he called the Norwegian sheep, the native breed. This is what he said: where the pasture and management are favorable, the wool is very fine, resembling that of Shetland. But in other parts of the same islands, the wool is stunted and coarse, the animal sickly and puny, and frequently carries 4 or even 6 horns. So not all primitive sheep looked the same. Their appearance was evidently influenced by different management practices, which brings in a swathe of social and economic issues. Now, if we turn back to St Kilda, it's clear that control of livestock has been very important at some time in the distant past. Head dikes of turf and stone have been constructed, and certain promontories have been cut off, though it's hard to guess whether they were intended to keep animals in or out. This is Village Bay on Hirta, and on the left-hand slide, you can see the line of what seems to be, which is certainly a head dike of a group of very irregular fields, and that's indicated, you can probably see it better than I can, with the blue arrow on the right hand of your slide. You can see it, it's outside the head dike of the 1830s, and it runs all the way to the left of the photograph, and is actually cut off by the sea. The early Royal Commission people thought it was an old trackway, but it certainly isn't. It's a robbed out head dike. And there's another one, an earlier one, threading its way through those ancient fields a little bit below it. I've done a close-up of that, so you can see what that old head dike looks like, the one on Hirta. You can see it's a turf and stone wall built on the front edge of a terrace. And then if you go to Glenmore, which is the other valley on the same island, the valley where people transhumed, transhuming is a big word, the valley where dairying was carried on, recorded history, you can see another very nice head dike, which wasn't quite finished, but has the same characteristics as the one over in Village Bay. Terrace and the barrier evidently running along the front edge. And the most amazing thing, really, is the Isle of Borerays, which you've heard about before, because in the late 20th century, Mary Harman was rather astonished to discover an old field system on that island with, as you can see, what you'd probably call a head dike, or most of us would, a discovery which is highlighted in the more recent Royal Commission visit. And it was they who produced that very nice little plan on the left-hand side of this slide. Do you fancy having a farm on an island like that? But you can see that these people have got a head dike. They are differentiating between so-called fields and the area outside the head dike. The making of these dikes would have involved the use of turf. And for turf construction, you need to find turfs with an intricate root mat, the kind produced by grazing of sheep at fairly high densities. Experts say that the island of Hirta has the capacity to carry about 1,000 primitive sheep, far more than the islanders would need to clothe themselves in wool. The possibility would have existed on Hirta for the development of a serious sheep ranch with wool or woven fabric for export. If the overall flock size was deliberately increased, the quality of the pasture, of the wool, and of constructional turf would all have improved significantly. And despite the communitarian tradition of the island's community, the development of flocks considerably larger than those dictated by household needs is not historically unknown. In the 18th century, the head honcho on Hirta seems to have been something of a sheep baron. And in 1930, the only people who seriously opposed the plan to evacuate Hirta were the Fergusons, the Grand Officer's family, who owned over 40% of the sheep at the time, and were the only ones who had a serious vested interest in staying there. Those who wrote about St Kilda have recognized a Norse presence there, basing their view mainly on the presence of Norse toponyms, including those representing misunderstanding by speakers of Gaelic. More recently, Roderick MacDonald has worked more generally on Norse loanwords in Gaelic, particularly names for seabirds at St Kilda, and words relating to fouling. But what about the St Kilda archaeological record? It's become traditional to list a rather scrappy roll call of archaeological evidence. However, this does include 2 tortoise brooches, one of which was illustrated by the great Danish archaeologist, Jens Warsaw. And this must be a seriously important grave, surely. There was also once a grave containing a large whetstone, an iron sword, a spearhead, and various other pieces of iron. In the 18th century, some fishermen found 2 antique urns containing what was described as a quantity of Danish silver coins. None of this stuff has survived, and archaeologists have traditionally been reluctant to make much of it. But what if these things are straws in the wind? Rather an appropriate metaphor for St Kilda, you might think. Perhaps, as Shakespeare put it, the fault, dear Brutus, is in ourselves. The traditional archaeological view has been that such a distant archipelago must always have been margined and always was regarded as such. Such a view may be misguided. If we look through one end of the historian's telescope, St Kilda looks exactly like the kind of remote place which would naturally become the refuge for 3 ancient races of sheep. But if we look through the other end, we might discover a certain historical vibrancy. Perhaps, back in the day, even remote St Kilda was able to command most of the resources available to other communities in the region. Keeping the local sheep up to date was but one facet of such interconnectedness. But that, of course, is a longer story. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you so much, Andrew. It's wonderful to see the different strands woven together like that, if I can follow that analogy. If I could perhaps start off the discussion. I'm fascinated by the fact that we retain 3 distinct breeds of sheep. That isn't accidental. You can't, if you put them together, they're going to interbreed, presumably. Yes. So there's something culturally quite distinct about these communities and their perception of what's important with the sheep. And that keeping them separate seems to me to be very interesting. I wonder whether that's something that you've thought about in this context.
Well, in a way, the separateness is a kind of natural one in the archipelago, of course, because they happily had a couple of outlying islands they could put the more old-fashioned ones on. But they don't, it's difficult to know how far they moved rams from different breeds around. Even in recorded history, it's not very, it's not often mentioned. No. Genetics will sometimes pick up things, though. It's interesting, actually, that it's in the record that they tried to introduce some more modern rams onto the Isle of Soays in the 1850s. And this is in the literature, that the Soays Sheep Project people themselves did some genetic testing, and they were able to pick this up, which is quite interesting. And it suggests to me that genetic work, for instance, on the Borerays, might show us the extent to which they were left alone and the extent to which periodically particular rams were brought in. There's an interesting twist to it, though, because, as I don't think I really had time to say, the Soays traditionally belong to the laird, and the ones on Borerays belong to the people of St Kilda. So there may well have been different policies about introducing rams, and well, different policies about everything, really. The Borerays, they were clearly more relaxed about Borerays. It was easier to reach Borerays. Only 4 miles as opposed to 9 for Soays. So there are, you can play quite a lot, I think, with the differences on the different islands.
Thank you. Open it up for questions and comments. Someone right at the back in the corner there.
Thank you, Professor Fleming. Just a quick question. With the Soays and the image you showed, that it's believed that they date back to the Bronze Age, have there been any material remains of Soays being found within Bronze Age contexts in other parts of the British Isles to maybe allude to maybe some kind of trade or gift giving or anything along that way?
Well, I think my view of the historic position of Soays is influenced by Michael Ryder's view, which was based quite a lot on the quality of the fleece as it had evolved or been bred from earlier ancestors. And he tended to think that it was a kind of Bronze Age stage that was represented. I'm not too familiar with what the animal bone people say about this, whether the size of their sheep bones corresponds in any way to the size of modern Soays. I'm told that quite often when people do animal bone reports these days, the demand is for a minimum effort. People don't necessarily follow trails suggested by thinking about sheep size. I'm afraid I'm rather ignorant.
I can tell you a bit about size, which is that the Soays correspond to the smallest you find archaeologically, which is Iron Age sheep. Bronze Age ones are a bit bigger, Neolithic ones are a bit bigger still. But that doesn't necessarily mean, I don't think, that they weren't introduced in the Neolithic or the Bronze Age to St Kilda, because they would naturally have become smaller by living on a small island in a restricted environment with a restricted diet. So whether they reached there in the Neolithic or the Bronze Age is really over to people like you and Mary Harmon, who would know whether there's other evidence for people being there in the Neolithic and the Bronze Age.
Well, we have got a few Neolithic sherds from Hirta because I found them myself. So there is a Neolithic presence there now, which wasn't known until relatively recently. But what those and also petrological work has shown that these sherds were made of clay on the island. So the implication is that there were Neolithic people settled there, but there's not much more evidence at the moment. But I think we can assume that there was a Neolithic.
Online.
Thank you. We've had a question online asking if you have any views on the relationship between the Borerays and the apparently extinct Scottish dunface.
I'm not sure that I do really. I think there's labeling sheep from their appearance, and especially postulating an old race of sheep which largely became extinct in the 18th century, has become quite a difficult game. You were probably, when you saw the different attributions of the Borerays sheep or the different things which they're supposed to resemble, you could be forgiven for having become a bit confused. And I think we're probably waiting for geneticists to clear some of these things up. And, there are dun faces, there are tan faces, and there are short walls, and they're the same thing. And the labeling, sorting out the labels leads to a great deal of confusion. But I don't really quite know about the Borerays. I don't really quite know to what extent they represent an old and relatively unchanged Iron Age sheep, or to what extent they've been much modified since the Iron Age. So I'm not able to be more helpful at the moment.
Are there any more questions or comments? If not, can we thank Andrew again for a fantastically wide-ranging paper. I give notice that the next meeting will be our Out of London meeting in Exeter on Thursday, the 13th of February. That's next Thursday, with a 1 o'clock lunchtime start, when we will hear a paper, Arthur's Stone, a Neolithic chambered tomb in Herefordshire, by Professor Julian Thomas, Fellow. Meeting stands adjourned. There's a reception across the hall.